Hi, hey everybody. Welcome to the Uber Cordero show for this week. It's a snowy day right here in my home, and my co-host Olivia is not going to make it. And because of that, I'm going to have to do a presentation on neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, which I've been planning to do for quite a while. So it's going to be a lecture style, monologue, and it's not going to be as conversational as it will be if I had Olivia here. Now, here's one housekeeping thing I want to say. And it is that this show, the Uber Cudero show, has been picked up by a radio station called the Black Atlantic Radio.com. And it is an online based radio running from Miami, hosted by DJ Kerry Pastena. So if you like what we're doing here and you'd like to support it, you can check out DJ Pesena's radio show, and I will be including the links down here, so you'll be part of it. But also don't forget to subscribe and to send us comments about what you want us to talk about. And we're going to try and break them down and make them simple for you, which is really why we do this show. Now, I'm going to be starting my presentation in a little while. Let me first share my screen with you. Um, Now, I'm talking about the Washington Consensus and East Africa's political economy. I'm talking about this because I've been asked questions to elaborate a little bit about the economies of East Africa and why they're like that. So this presentation is part of a process of elaborating on things economics. Now, what is the Washington Consensus? It is a set of policies advocated by the world's leading financial institutions, namely the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the US Treasuries, and the likes. And these institutions adopted economic thinkings that had risen out of a school of thought, economic school of thought called the Chicago School in the 1960s. And one of the things that they argue for is the lessening of government role in the economy and a much more elaborate role of the private sector in terms of economic well-being. In addition to that, they teach sort of economic thinking that advocates for austerity, like less spending, less government spending, so and reduction of things like welfare and also the supremacy of the market. Now let the market decide things, and the government should take a second role in on economic matters. So that's pretty much what the Washington Consensus is. It's the agreement that this model of economic thinking is best for developing countries to steer themselves towards economic development. It focuses a lot more on GDP growth and less on economic development. These are two different things. I'll illustrate a little bit. And the key tenets of Washington Consensus is embedded on economic policy called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is relative to liberalism. And in liberalism is laissez-faire, the economic models which preaches the market as central in economic calculation and economic choices. Neoliberalism is the inclusion of liberal economics, but with an added role of the government to support foreign direct investment to create conducive environment for commerce to take place. Now, it is neo because in all liberalism, the government is pretty much absent, according to Adam Smith. In neoliberalism, the government is there to facilitate commerce, but not to be engaged in the business of commerce and economic activities. I hope that's clear. Now, it is increasingly a free market economy in a neoliberal system, and that everything is up for sale. A second thing is that it's really state role in the attraction of foreign direct investment, in construction of facilitative infrastructure, in establishment of rule of law and protection of private property, but the government is not engaged as a business enterprise. Um, a key part of it is also the increasing role of the individual self-drive. Here we're talking about ambition, people's ambition, selfish drive. What makes you wake up to make money, to be better than how your father was. Neoliberal economics focuses on that, the self as a driver in growth, rather than the government making those decisions to facilitate your well-being. Another key tenet of it is financial liberalization, the ability of capital, that is the factor of resource that could flow from one area to another. So like an investor from New York could invest in Singapore, Brazil, South Africa, anywhere. Financial liberalization as a key tenet is one of the reasons why globalization took off right after the neoliberal reforms. So what leads to the Washington Consensus? And one of it is, in the context of East Africa, it is important to go back to the colonial period. And before 1945, colonial governments were really extractive. They did not attempt to develop economies in their colonial spaces for the purpose of development. They were mainly extractive. But from 1945, after the Second World War, there was an agreement that independence had to be given to these countries that were under colonial rule. And part of independence also included preparing their economies. And one way of doing that was a colonial government establishing ways in which they could earn money and create an economy. And they did this through creating of marketing board, parastatals, and a very small sector which was tied to the colonizers' economy. So the marketing boards were like facilitative to the agriculturalists, farmers of of coffee and tea, and they will make sure they have equipment that they could sell their products, and they also had the know-how to do this, and a market to sell what they had produced. In East Africa, there's the Kenya Tea Development Authority, the Coffee Farmers Association, and tobacco farmers unions and things like that. And parastatals were like government-owned corporations that would create jobs to many people and also take part as a player in the economy. And this, the private sector was really limited to shops called dukas, owned mostly by the Asian immigrant in East Africa. They were also small schools and things of that nature. It wasn't really big in the colonial space. But as we move to the independence era in the 1960s, there's this push for self-reliance that the colonial spaces, the colonial masters have left, they've moved back to Europe. And there's an understanding that these independent countries have to create a self-sustaining economic system. And now they adopt what had been practiced in South America, in Latin America, a system called the import substitution industries. What this meant was, instead of importing everything from the colonial powers, they were to create an industry that would facilitate production of house commodities in their own spaces. So you have like production of sugar mill industries, making shoes, making clothes, making nails, industries that will do that. The problem was that most of these products that they were manufacturing were expensive in the external market because they had a problem of overvalued currencies. I'll talk about this. At this time, in Kenya, for example, one Kenya shilling will go for about 20 UK pound. One Tanzanian shilling was about 17 US dollars. There was also a limited market in that the colonial experience hadn't created a functioning middle class that had the financial resources to consume products that they were making. And also they had the challenge of inefficiency. Many of these parastatal bodies that they are formed and industries were highly inefficient. They were had the pathology of ethnic politics. People were hiring. There was redundancy and things of that. So in short, it wasn't really functioning very well. So we go to the 80s, starting from the 80s. So we have a book here written by Markets and State in Tropical Africa by Robert Bates, and it talks about the urban problem, the urban bias. And the 1960s and 70s had led to a lot of people moving from rural areas to the urban centers. And this urban centers becomes like a politically active constituency that is vote rich and stuff. But they mostly live in semi developed areas, slum areas. And they can't afford food in the cities. So the government created a policy of discrimination of prices of agricultural commodities so that the urban people can access food without inexpensively, but to the detriment of agricultural dwellers in the rural countrysides, so that it's expensive for the government to keep the urban people happy. They have to infringe on the rights which they're given to the farmers. And what this does is that government starts getting into debt because it's expensive to keep voters happy. And in late 80s, we have a problem of an expansive and expensive state, which is so hard to maintain and requires a lot of debt. And this regime maintenance leads to problems in the 1980s, you talk about here, where countries are in chaos, there are riots, there are coup d'etats, dictators are failing, and debt is skyrocketing. So that in 1970s, the whole of continent of Africa had a debt of about 2 billion. But by 1980, the debt had reached to $60 billion. There was also the surge of the informal economy, people selling shoes by the roadside, people selling smuggled commodities from other countries, and just an informal economy that operates outside the mainstream economy that hardly pays tax, but still relevant because it's a survival system for many people left out of these collapsing parastatal and government finance institutions. So the 80s become what we call the Last Decay, because there's debt and there is political crisis. And in addition to that, there's also the HIV crisis that's ravaging the whole continent. So now this leads to the Washington consensus, because private lenders in financial institutions from New York and London refused to lend African government because of bad debt. And now they go to the IMF, and they emerge as the lenders of last resort, starting from Mexico's default of its debt in 1970. So this was not a uniquely African problem, but it was an immense problem in African countries, as you can see from the case of Mexico as well. So they go to the international financial institutions to ask for debt, for loans, in order to keep up with payments, with short-term financial flows. And the Washington consensus do not force these African countries to make this reform, but makes it a condition of the loan, which they will get. Now it embeds neoliberal assumptions of the free market, of trade and investment as key ingredients of growth. So the governments are forced or are conditioned to liberalize their market, and they come through what were called structural adjustment policies starting from 1982. And they come in two parts. The first part is called the stabilization. So here is where the IMF focuses on enabling the economy, the macroeconomic security, to be salvaged, because some of these countries really had lost that. And secondly, there's the pathway towards economic growth. That is done by the World Bank through restoring economic growth through, by things like construction of roads and facilitative processes that will allow the economy then to take off. So this is starting from 80s, 82, 86, 89. And as that happens, um, things are happening. For example, let's look at Tanzania, where, like I said, in the 80s, they are forced to float their currency in the market, in the international market, so it's subject to flows, booms and busts of the market. And their currency, the Tanzanian shilling, was going for about 17 shillings in 1980s. By 1990s, it was 503 by for $1, 791 in 2000 for $1, and right now it stands at almost 2,400 for $1. So as these currencies are floated in the market, they become really weak, and that leads to another problem of loan repayment, which I'll get to into in a minute. The other aspects of the structural adjustment is that these governments are forced to balance their budget and to reduce military spending. In Kenya, this led to massive layoffs of people in the Moi government from 1998 to 2000. Thousands of people, middle-aged career people, were gotten rid from their jobs because the government was trying to make the budget meet. And trade liberalization, this means that the government is now out of the economy, and instead private sector is coming strong. So here you start having many TV stations that are privatized. You start having the collapsing of government parastatals. You also start to see a lot more foreign investments coming in from actors such as China, such as US, Canada, South Africa, with much more financial push than the local enterprises. So these government entities are then sold. The formerly import substitution industries are now sold and are replaced by private enterprise. So what have been the consequences of these changes that I've discussed? One of them, in Tanzania, President Nyerere had experimented with Ujamaa policy, which is like a African self-reliance initiative based on the family as the starting unit. And it failed partly because of how ineffective the implementation was, but also because the international community simply did not support it. And at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1980, Nyerere increasingly, from the 70s, the Soviets were like going down. So Nyerere lacked funding, and under pressure, he's forced to do these neoliberal reforms, which he don't want to do. So he resigns in 85. So one of the political consequences in East Africa of neoliberal reforms was the collapse of Nyerere and his resignation from presidency in 85. In Uganda, Museveni embraced it. He comes to power in the 80s when this is fashionable, and he adopts it. And Nyerere and Uganda starts like a staggering economic growth because a lot of financial investment come into the country. But what doesn't happen is economic growth in Uganda. So on one hand, there is economic growth. On the other hand, there's really limited economic development. In Kenya, in the 80s, the structural adjustment policies lead to a lot of street riots because the youth are graduating from colleges, from universities, and they're not getting jobs. They become restless. These political crises happening in the 80s, a purge of intellectuals, and the Moi government become increasingly repressive. It leads to, in 2002, the collapse of the Moi regime as he resigns and is barred from running again, but he loses an election. And KANU, the Independent Party of Kenya, loses its seat. It also entrenches ethnic politics because as resources becomes little and the patronage network that had allowed these regimes to exist shrinks, then ethnicity now becomes an issue of concern for many, looking for who to blame. And it leads to the relaunching of the East African community East African community in 1999 in an attempt to expand the market so that East African could have a bigger share, a much more elaborate market to engage with for those who had the financial resources to do that. So those are some of the political consequences of neoliberalism. I'm going to go to the economic consequences. And one of them is that it's difficult to argue that Uganda didn't benefit from the Museveni's regime under neoliberal policies. Poverty reduced exponentially from 1992 to 2013, but it became increasingly vulnerable. Like two people will get out of poverty, but one person will fall back. So it was like a marked about turn in some ways, but also growth in others. So there was also high economic growth rate, but relatively low development. And this was common across the East African countries. Average growth rate for the region was about 5.3%, but it was characterized by increased debt, dispossession of the poor people from their lands, for infrastructural projects, income inequality, and increasing vulnerability. Now, one of them is now what I go to, it's called the social network of safety net. This is kind of like the process of Harambee. In Kenya, they call it Harambee. But what this means is that previously, the government would come in and help people if there was a need for example, a much more efficient healthcare system, educational subsidies, and food rations. Now, as the government shrinks in its capacity and withdraws, now these services have still to be offered, but guess who's going to offer them? People. So you have people who still have these jobs getting incredible pressure from their relatives to perform because the government is not. Because the middle class is vulnerable. And in this case, the middle class is defined as those who make between $2 to $20 per day, and an increasing role of non-governmental organization, particularly in Uganda, where a new set of thinking, evangelical Christians, become increasingly powerful and challenges normative aspects of society. For example, Uganda, gay rights become like a big issue of concern because of the increasing power of evangelical Christian, mainly from the Christian South, the United States South, who do a lot of good work, but highlight some of these issues of LGBT that previously were issues, but were not as pronounced as they were in the neoliberal regime. Informal urbanization. So the government's not doing really low income construction of houses, and people are moving from the rural areas to the urban centers, but they do not have places to stay. They end up living in an informal setup. And a rather negative consequence of social consequence of neoliberal policies is the stratified racial relationship. Like association with whiteness become like a commodity that can be sold and be made for money. So NGOs, predominantly white people from North America and Europe, are not really seen as people per se, but the opportunities that they offer to people through marriages, through investment, and opportunities of such kind. So, not that it was not happening, but neoliberal reforms make this much more a pronounced feature of society because of the needs of the time. Economic needs become much more dire. So now let's go to what the debates on this, and I'm going to make this a two-way debate. One of it is that there are those who argue that neoliberal reforms have increased poverty, commodified so cultures, and stifled industrialization and growth. And here we have people like Joseph Stiglitz, who is a World Bank and IMF economist, and as long as Ha Jong Chong, a Korean scholar, as well as Thomas Piketty, who writes the book Capital, a Nobel Prize economic winner, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. Now, this guy's general argument is that neoliberalism will not lead to development. It will not industrialize. It will increase and entrench inequalities. But the growth that it does, because it focuses on GDP growth as opposed to economic development, is not a good enough reason for it to continue existing. And there should be reforms on how to practice capitalism without necessarily making it really embedded on neoliberal ideas because it dispossesses. And in fact, John Chong's book, Kicking Away the Ladder, makes the argument that no country has ever developed following these neoliberal reforms, and that even countries like China or North Korea, Singapore, United States, and Western Europe were not entirely free markets at the time when they were industrializing. And it's an interesting debate to have, one which I do not have the time to explore in this presentation. So these are anti-neoliberal debate, but there's also pro-foreign. One of them is Dambisa Moyo. She writes a book in 2009 called Dead Aid. And in this book, she says, well, the problem is not neoliberal reforms. The problem is the inefficiency of the African government and the corruption and the toxic environment that it operates in that limits a perfect market from being created. And if we create a perfect market, and then the government won't be needed in the economy. And the same argument is made by Robert Calderi in The Trouble with Africa. He makes kind of the same argument, as well as Devin D. Mind the Gap. And this approach is that the problem is not whether you adopt a neoliberal policy or if you adopt a purely strong government policy, like a social democrat economic viewpoint, or even a communist viewpoint. The problem is if you have a weak state, a government that cannot function, cannot do its primary role of protection of property and protection of life and a rule of law, then any economic system that you adopt is bound to fail. And that's what these guys talk about, especially Devin D. Robert Caldesiri is a Canadian guy, but he's a little more leaning on a much more neoliberal perspective. So it's not. But Devin D says the problem is the government. Government has to do its job, which is to govern. And it's not doing that in East Africa and in Africa at large. So now, what I'm talking about here is what we call debt imperialism, and the idea that neoliberal institutions facilitated recession of economies that were almost going to the dogs. But it also led to access to capital that had been previously not possible. And it's like you see increasing investment in infrastructural projects like the one that I'm showing here in Uganda, which is financed by debt from China and from other countries, but which are done in order to facilitate economic growth. But if many Ugandans aren't even driving cars, many Ugandans hardly graduate out of colleges. And if they do graduate, do not have jobs, then who is going to buy the cars to drive in this expensive highway? What I'm getting at is that economic growth is good, but economic development is even better because it increases people's well-being. And infrastructural projects that promise the future have to deliver the present as well, and that's not really happening. Instead, you have debt imperialism, like the ownership, marginal ownership of a country by external actors whose interest is not into the development of the country, interest is focused on profit for the shareholders. So now you see in Kenya's case here, I borrowed this from Ken Opala. It tracks down Kenya's debt from 1960s at independence to the Moi era. And here you look at the Kenyatta regime, debt increasing towards the end of his regime, but not as much. And when you see Moi, that increased to the highest level in the 1990s, and then drops under a democratic Moi, and then decreases radically under Kibaki, and then takes up again in the reign of Uhuru Kenyatta II. So what we're talking about is that when a regime is not democratic, they attract more debt. When it is democratic, there is less debt. When it's questionable, when it's not having enough civil society organization to question what it does, then it also increases debt. That it becomes a little authoritarian. So my reading of this is that You need a democracy. You need active civil service to fight that, because an authoritarian regime is dangerous, because nobody questions why you're borrowing the money. They just go willy-nilly and do whatever they want. It's important to think about this a little bit. So my conclusion is that while the impacts of neoliberal policies have transformed the East African economy, it's hard to conclusively state if those consequences have been as a result of neoliberalism as an economic model, or a much more present problem in Africa, the inability of the state to govern. So I agree with Devin B. We need to have a conversation on how to make the governments work better, rather than having a discussion where the neoliberalism or social democracy or classical liberalism or communism is going to be the way to be. The question is not, it's not, it's not whether the government is adopting a right economic approach. The question is whether the government is actually governing. Thank you guys all, and I hope this presentation was stimulating. And if you like what I'm talking about, please subscribe and please continue to share this out. And I will see you next time. Have a blessed day.